Ah, the liver. Yes. So there can be sorry, we got cut off, so I'm going to kind of continue my thought there. There can be certain things that I will perceive just from the conversation I have with my Western bodybuilding clients that I recognize are indicative of Eastern pattern diagnoses. So in Chinese medicine, you can call that a diagnosis, or you can call it a pattern differentiation. But you see certain things, and then you know what disharmony is in place, and that's all in the Chinese medical paradigm. So it would just be, it'd be speaking Greek if I tried to explain those things. But then I can send my clients to acupuncturists in their local area, and they can see them, and then that helps me help them even more. I can't necessarily treat them unless they're here local to me. I could do that when I had my gym, my holistic health club, as we called it. But so it helps a good bit. It's widened my perspective on how important things are outside of the box of being a strength conditioning coach or being an exercise physiologist or being just bodybuilding is completely holistic. I think that's why I'm so fascinated by it, because everything, it's a quote unquote a lifestyle, as so many people say, but everything is important if you're trying to eke out, sort of optimize your progress, because you're really trying to hack through your body's genetics to produce an adaptation and go places that your physiology is capable of. And then if we're talking about assisted, enhanced bodybuilding, then you're capable of with pharmacological assistance. But it's very much trying to optimize, just like optimizing sporting performance. We're trying to optimize particular aspects of your anatomy, so to speak, through physiological adaptive processes. And it's you got to take everything in consideration, dot every I, cross every T, and that's what Chinese medicine is about. But there are things that bodybuilders typically wouldn't necessarily think about or have solutions for, you know. So like just stuff like having done internal martial arts, Tai Chi and Qigong for so long, I can recognize what kind of effect that can have on someone's mentality. And a thing that I often mention, and I've been saying for years now, is you look at like a lot of the best bodybuilders in the world. Not all of them, but a lot of the really good ones. It's sort of an uncanny trend. They've got tremendous genetics all in all, but one of the things that they tend to do really well, Ronnie Coleman is one that, pretty much everyone knows, is Ronnie trained like an absolute animal. People back in the day when he first became Mr. Olympia, they tried to do what he did, and no one could train that way. They just couldn't recover. They could try to, but it wasn't going to work for them. It's just too much. But Ronnie's also a pretty chill guy otherwise. He's pretty relaxed. So that's a good feature to have, and that can be very much not the mindset that many bodybuilders have, because they want to go, go, go and optimize everything and be OCD and being frantic and OCD and constantly kind of wanting to grind throughout the day doesn't help you recover, which is where the growth occurs, which is where the progress occurs. It's the training sets it in motion, and then it happens outside of the training. So just recognizing that, and having been exposed to people in Chinese medicine who have completely different personalities, you might say. It's a very, very different world. You're talking to someone, who, like the woman that taught me the Tai Chi that I learned in acupuncture school. She was a craniosacral expert. I don't know if you know what craniosacral therapy is. But a lot of what she would do would just basically be cradling the person's head for an hour, doing energy work, just pure energy work. And can you imagine, bodybuilders are coming and they're looking to like rip people's heads off and tear the roof off, bend bars and go bonkers. It's an uncaged animal, right? Going to town. Cranial sacral work is just the polar opposite of that. So I was being exposed. I was competing when I was in acupuncture school. So I'm being exposed to. I'm training like an animal, and then the next day we're doing Tai Chi, moving in slow motion. Trying to feel our dantian, our energetic center, tracing energy through the various acupuncture meridians. So having that perspective and recognizing that paradigm, that way of thinking, being able to calm down and relax, is super important for bodybuilders. And seeing guys like Dexter Jackson and Jay Cutler and Ronnie Coleman, all Mr. Olympias, and lots of bodybuilders who are really good. They're just chill guys. They're just relaxed. And that could be what's missing from someone who's like always like, oh my God, am I doing this right? Am I doing that right? And I want to grow faster, and they're just frustrated. Like, that doesn't help. So there's just one example that popped into my head, a way in which I can use, and there are some herbal remedies. I say I'm not practicing acupuncture in this. I can't do it. It's legal, but there are some herbal remedies you can prescribe that work pretty well, just in general, without having done a detailed intake and analysis of someone. So I can use some Chinese medicine in that way, but it's the paradigm and the perspective of being open and available for complementary medicine. And I mean, the name of my business is Integrative Bodybuilding. So it's integrative medicine, trying to integrate as many things as possible. And just like the scientific training has given me a perspective, just because, I know I can rattle off the names of a bunch of researchers, that doesn't necessarily mean anything in particular for how someone's going to train per se, but it's given me insights. So it's hard to put your finger down, and you'll probably see this, I'm betting. I first saw this when you take anatomy and physiology. When I first took A&P, I've been training for years, just on my own, but I knew kind of what I was doing. But once I started learning about origin, insertion, action, nerve, and blood supply, thinking about and knowing all the muscles and how they synergize, and that was just a basic A&P class. I'm like, this is so cool. I started like figuring out, like, I can do an exercise this way and this way, and that information became integrated. So the more you know, as long as there's some general relevance, the more those things get blended in some way you can't necessarily parcel out anymore. And Chinese medicine, without a doubt, has done that and allowed me to think in an integrative fashion, a complementary fashion. So, and I'll go back to that. So I maintain the license because I'll go back to that eventually when I'm too old for bodybuilding, or maybe I just want to shift more towards make with people one-on-one and make a part-time practice. I'll go back to doing that, I think, and work with people.
Yeah, I think that was one perspective. Like Ben Topolsky, I listened to a lot of his stuff. He really got me into bodybuilding as well, or just the idea of learning about that. Mr.
Who
Ben
was it?
Topolsky.
Oh, Ben,
Ben,
right.
yeah. And he always talked about how the idea of learning how to downregulate later in his career was really what allowed him to basically achieve the big thing that he wanted at one of his last showings, where it was, early on in his career, he was very hard-headed, he called himself, and then learning how to downregulate just simply improved his recovery by leaps and bounds. So I think a lot of times it feels like you're doing something correctly when you're working yourself to the bone, but sometimes just taking a step back and actually allowing yourself to recover is what you actually need to do. So I think that I definitely think that's an awesome message. And I
A
kind of
thought,
believe,
two thoughts for you before we leave that. One, I know Ben. I lived in Tampa when he was in Tampa. I don't think he lives there anymore, but I met him early on before he'd made that shift, and I never trained with him. I had I had an injury that kind of disallowed that. Eventually, we did train together, but when he was in his career and he wanted to train, and I always had the sense Ben was known for training really hard, and he wanted to train with me, and he trained with one of my good friends too, Jordan Peters. And Ben wanted to Ben had a very alpha male take on things. I think he probably would sort of admit this. So I got to interact with Ben periodically over the years, and then I interact with him more recently down at his gym after he'd retired and after he'd made that shift. So what you said about Ben, I actually saw that over the span of maybe 8 years in terms of his personality and our interaction. Um, and the other thought, I mean, just as something to consider for you, with acupuncture, I went to acupuncture school after I completed my PhD. I had a master's degree and a PhD, and it's actually a master's degree that you earn there, but there's no undergraduate required. And one of the things that I've recommended and talked to people about, and what I was actually planning, part of the reason why I went into acupuncture in conjunction with my professorial position was to make that known. We had a large Asian American contingent at the university where I taught, Cal Poly Pomona in California, and acupuncture is a great field there You can become a primary care provider in California as you can in Florida as an acupuncturist. And for people who want to get into medicine and help people, and maybe, I had my experience with Western medicine. I didn't want to go and become a physician. Acupuncture would be an option for you. There's not a, I don't know if there's a school in North Carolina. I don't think so.
I could
Um,
definitely look into it. Yeah.
you check it out. It's a 3-year program, about 3,000 hours, as many hours as you get in Western medical school. Uh, but you technically could start an acupuncture program um, and be an acupuncturist in 3 years.
All right.
So,
Yeah. I'll definitely look into that. I think that leads us into the first topic that we kind of discussed talking about, and
oh yeah, we've got topics
um,
today, don't we?
we do. I don't know if we'll get to many of them, but we'll definitely maybe try and do a part two as long as you're all right with that.
Sure.
Um, but it was really the idea of you hear a lot of mixed opinions on the place of fasting in not just bodybuilding, but in the general public, but specifically pertaining to you. What are your thoughts around in terms of bodybuilding? What is the place of fasting, intermittent or prolonged? And does it have a role? Does it have any benefits or side effects?
So, in a bodybuilding context, um, people would consider this or had considered this completely sacrilegious, right? Um, and there is kind of good reason for that. You can when you think about it scientifically, we know. For instance, there's a phenomenon or a strategy called protein pacing. RCRO, as you know this, yeah, this idea, and it fits with what bodybuilders have been doing for decades. It leads us maybe if you want to get into that idea of the muscle full effect. But there is something to say for protein intake being spread throughout the day. There are some studies that have been done where they've tried different timing regimens of protein. For instance, once there was a study, it was 20 grams of protein every 4 hours compared to 10 grams every 2 hours or 40 grams every 8 hours. And the sweet spot in terms of overall protein synthesis was that 20 grams or so every 4 hours, something like that. So there is some utility, and then RCRO stuff shows that it makes sense to spread your protein throughout the day, um, and that in itself flies in the face of the idea of having prolonged periods of fasting. Um, there's also some work that's come out of the Netherlands or Belgium um, with nighttime protein, like even the oldest study with casein shows you get better protein synthesis when you have a constant or continuous influx of a whole amino acid source, a whole protein source. So being fasted where you're basically missing out on some large chunk of the day in terms of protein synthesis doesn't mean you're going to just wither away, right? It's this you technically would be catabolic, so to speak, in that at that time period, but your body can make up for those things. Your body's very good at maintaining a homeostatic place. Um, you see, even if you look back at some of the stuff that people never even talk about, but some of the earlier nitrogen balance studies, and well, nitrogen balance is not quantitative. This is the idea, and I don't know if you think your listeners would know what nitrogen balance is and what I mean by that.
If you want to give them the brief 30-second
Okay,
rundown.
sure, yeah. Protein is 16% nitrogen, basically. So you can look at the nitrogen coming in the diet and the nitrogen leaving the body um, in urine primarily, feces, nails, skin, hair, if they want to get down to the nitty gritty. And then you can say, if we know the protein coming in versus the protein coming out, we can have a balance sheet. We can figure out how it's balanced. And if more is coming in than it's leaving the body, then that's a positive nitrogen balance. That suggests we're having protein synthesis outweighing protein degradation, and protein is accruing somewhere in the body. So that would be, as a whole body nitrogen balance would be an indicator of protein synthesis, especially in the context of training that you would expect is going on in terms of muscle growth. Hopefully you're not just growing all your organs and that's where the protein's going. It's going towards muscle if we're training for muscle growth. So, but even some of those early studies using nitrogen balance, and it doesn't work out actually quantitatively. You can be in like negative nitrogen balance and not see the loss even positive nitrogen, to see the loss or accrual of actual body protein that those nitrogen balance days would suggest. But qualitative, at least, you see that when the nitrogen intake or the protein intake goes down, people eat less protein, then protein degradation also adjusts. So the nitrogen balance will tend to balance itself out somewhat substantially. And that's just the body adapting its protein metabolism within some boundaries to the incoming protein, adjusting itself to what's available. So that's why, like, if you're fasting, you're doing intermittent fasting where you eat for 8 hours, let's say, in the 16 other hours of the day, you're not eating anything. So I feel like most people are. They're probably like, I got 2 minutes to finish my last meal, and they finish their last meal and they're full and they have 16 hours. They're probably not post-absorptive. They're still absorbing food in their bloodstream for the next 8 hours after that or longer. There's a study with it was a mixed macronutrient meal. It was like pizza, and I can't remember what else. I remember pizza was in there. It was like a 700 or 800 calorie meal, and it took like 10 hours for the person to become post-absorptive. It wasn't a giant meal. It wasn't like the massive 3,000 calorie feast. That's why when they say, do your blood work post-absorptive, they say 12 hours, right? Don't eat it for 12 hours just to make sure that you're actually in that state. So fasting still, though, misses out on some of that period of time during the day if you're doing intermittent fasting regime, where you could be having a positive protein balance, a positive nitrogen balance. And if you look at, and this is how, if you listen to my podcasts, I've mentioned this a good bit. If you look at what it means in terms of protein balance over the course of the long haul, if you're just, I think the number it works, if you just have a positive protein balance of 7 grams of protein a day, we'll just presume that goes into skeletal muscle, and muscle is roughly 25% protein, something like that. We'll make it easy. So 7 grams gives you 7 grams of protein deposited in muscle per day. So you're someone who eats 200 grams of protein a day, and 193 of that is oxidized and used up, of course, of just replenishing body proteins in all of its various forms. But you've got 7 grams of it that ends up being incorporated into myofibrillar protein and the associated proteins in muscle cells. That's 7 grams of protein that gives you about an ounce, 28 grams roughly of muscle per day, and you add that up over a 365-day year, and you've got like 23 or 24 pounds of muscle in a year. That's a massive growth. That's incredible. So imagine then, so let's just take the 200 number. Let's say it's 2,400. Just make it easy. So that's 2,400 over 24-hour day. So that's about 240 grams of protein. So that's over 24-hour day. So that's like 10 grams of protein is your protein metabolism per hour. Okay? So it's not a lot. But if we look back at that 7 grams of protein, positive protein balance, right? That's not very much. That's 3.5%, or for 240 grams a day, that's like 3% of your daily protein intake. And you go into an intermittent fasting situation, and you see this in some of the studies, at least that I've looked at, is you're not losing tons of muscle, but you do have unfavorable changes in terms of things like testosterone levels and thyroid levels when you go with intermittent fasting. So those aren't necessarily putting in the best place for holding on to muscle mass and probably not building it. But if we just we need that little 3% difference. That's not much to make massive gains. 1.5%, 1% difference in protein metabolism needs 10 pounds of muscle in a year. That's massive gains. So that's only if you're creeping forward a bit by bit, day by day. Then if you go in an intermittent fasting situation, and let's say during those 8 hours when you eat, even the next 8 hours, you've done well. Like you're in the 3 or 4% positive protein balance, and then you have 8 hours where you're not. 8 hours where there's no income protein source. You go into negative protein balance. If we're thinking about 10 grams of protein metabolism, breakdown and synthesis, metabolism being those two things combined, over the course of 8 hours, that's 80 grams of protein. You can easily lose that 7, 8, 10 grams of protein positive balance because you didn't eat anything for those 8 hours. Now that's mathematically, it's much more complicated than that. But if you just think about it in a very generalized sense, it's like it certainly helps when people don't miss meals, stick to their diet, have a continuous stream of not only protein but also some nutrients, or you need the energy to build the muscle. There's a very cool review article by Slater is the first name, and they looked into what it actually takes, like calorically, energetically, to build muscle mass, and it's an energetically expensive process. And once you get past newbie gains, where the stimulus is enough to evoke the protein synthetic machinery, make some gains, then you have to be sure if you're going to try to push beyond that and hack the system, there's got to be sufficient energy. And you really got to have all the I's dotted, all the T's crossed. So you take someone who's already put on, 15 pounds of muscle, 20 pounds of muscle, and they're pretty much getting close to what they're going to possibly get, no matter what. They may not get any more muscle unless they really push the food. They may have to put on their P ratio, so the relative ratio. You know this term too. You know all the science. I love this. You've heard me ramble about this stuff too. Their P ratio is going to can be pretty poor potentially, just to get new muscle mass. So the last thing someone's going to do, let's say in that scenario where they put on a lot of muscle mass over the years, and they're just scraping to add more muscle mass, the last thing they can do is get away with missing meals, so to speak, in the form of having an intermittent fasting style of approach. So that's one entry point into the question. The other is, and this is where my beloved friend John Meadows, rest in peace, was first introducing this and talking about it with a lot of his clients, in two contexts. It can be, and this is something I've done for years with people, is if you've got someone who's a bodybuilder, who's really been pushing his food, is eating above maintenance, who's eating when he or she's not necessarily wanting to, it's not just an instinctive, I'm hungry, I'll eat type of diet. They have to push the food. Their digestive system can get wrecked. It can be really difficult to do that. So it's a very, very nice thing to be able to step back and have a day where, like, gosh, I don't have to eat anything. I'm going to have a light breakfast today, and then I could just fast the rest of the day. Oh, thank goodness. And then the next day, food actually tastes good, which you may not have experienced this, but that is something that when a bodybuilder is sort of pushing to figure out how big and how much he can grow, the food intake is very high. That's really, really nice to have actually a meal that you enjoy, because you're almost never hungry. In fact, the rule of thumb is if you're getting hungry, you're probably not eating enough. Unfortunately, that's sort of the case. And then on the other hand, with individuals who are dieting down and trying to get body fat off, because you don't all of a sudden just, go catabolic and drop muscle mass like crazy. It can be, for some people who have some stubborn fat loss, useful to just have a day where they're just basically doing a kind of a water fast or protein sparing modified fast. And it's a modified fast, not a true fast. So you take protein in, maybe a little bit more than a gram a pound. So 200-pound person, they might take in 250, maybe 300 grams of protein. Something like egg whites that will fill them up so it doesn't cause GI issues. And you cover their proteins it needs at least that will cut off the catabolism. And then you've got a massive caloric deficit on that day. You're going to oxidize a lot of fat. And that can be something, if you can include a number of those when someone's really trying to get down to low body fat, that can be helpful. And the thing is, most people will find too, and this doesn't work for everyone, but you miss a meal and you get hungry. And then if you go a little bit further and just sort of wait it out, there's a period where you're like, this is really uncomfortable. I'm pretty hungry. And then this is probably concomitant with ketogenesis. Ketones tend to inhibit appetite. Then you can go ketogenic, especially if you're deep into a diet, and then you're okay, and then you can handle the fast. I actually did basically a 9-day fast years ago. At one point in time, I think I had like 2 salads over the course of 9 days, and I was okay. I lifted, did everything fine. just a matter of, of having it right up in your head. So there's some utility there, without a doubt. Just for someone who's trying to have every signal towards anabolism and put on muscle mass, probably not ideal. The protein pacing idea does seem to help with retention of muscle mass. More protein does as well. Fasting is not going to be your best way to hold on to muscle mass, especially if you've got muscle mass, especially if you're lean and you've got muscle mass that you put on from training in training. If someone is, for instance, very, very overweight, the more body fat someone has, the less fat-free mass they lose during a diet. So that's why protein-sparing modified fasts are used with clinically obese people a good bit. They can hold on to fat-free mass much better than someone who's 6% and they're wanting to get to 4. Fasting then is going to be difficult. But if you have to, you can add those in that way. So does that get at your question on the fasting?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, I certainly think that, at least in the off season, as long as your appetite is decent, then you can't really think of a role for fasting. But I did want to see your opinion on possibly in the phase of leaning down, if it's useful for a bodybuilder to implement fasting, or if they just have such rapid rates of turnover for protein that they're at much more of a risk of actually losing muscle than maybe a general population who doesn't have quite as much protein but has a little bit more reserves in body fat.
Yeah, it kind of depends on it would be something you do with the person, a client whose main issue in terms of what they present on stage is body fat. Someone who's got plenty of muscle mass. They're not going on stage looking stringy. So they can sacrifice. You're not going to have a great P ratio when you're fasting anyway, but it might be worth it in those cases. It might be that last sort of step that you have to go to. So wouldn't use it universally whatsoever. With kind of lifestyle clients or with your average person, your general population, I mean, fasting has become kind of popular, you know. And if it's something that people like the idea of doing, it resonates with them, oh, absolutely, do it, right? If someone's like, let's say someone wants to eat carnivore, right? And they just trust that that's the way to go, and they want to tell their friends that they're eating carnivore, and presume that they've got good medical supervision, right? And they're not going to, you can trust that they're not going to go over the top. That might be the best diet is the one you can stick to in many cases. And a lot of times too, even if the diet may have what you might consider some imperfections in terms of being nutrient balanced and particularly healthy, that you can work around with vitamin mineral supplementation. Let's say, especially if someone's blood work comes back that they're becoming deficient, what have you, they have no medical issues. Then if someone feels better eating a certain diet, or they just, for whatever reason, feel more inclined to eat that diet, and they're trying to lose body fat, then adherence is the name of the game, as far as I'm concerned. You go with that. If someone wants to say no, like, oh, sorry, so what are you doing today? Well, Sunday's my fasting day. Like, oh, really? It's like, yeah, I just don't eat. Like, wow, you can do this. Like, I can do that. And something about that resonates with them. Then maybe it's sort of an egotistical way, whatever, but they like to do it, and they feel good. Some people, it does feel good to fast. I've done it before several times. I've got a friend who does fast regularly, part of a seasonal thing. And she does, cleans herself out, uses bentonite clay to clean out her GI tract, and she feels great when she does it. And there are times when she's missed it, and she can tell. Months later, could be psychological. I kind of doubt it with her. She's actually a therapist. She's pretty attuned to what's going on with her brain. And her consciousness, subconscious center. She's a Freudian trained psychotherapist. So anyway, if something resonates with someone, and it's not just like totally off the wall, like we're just going to eat, leaves all day long, whatever grows in your backyard, then, that can be very, very functional, because, we're omnivores as humans. And although we're always looking for the sort of the perfect diet, the answer, the quick down and easy way is what we most like. We can adapt to all sorts of potential diets. Um, I saw a video not long ago. There's a guy who's kind of a polyglot. He goes by Xiaoma. He speaks fluent Chinese and American though, and he learns languages really rapidly. And then he learned like Navajo in like 6 weeks. And then he went to a reservation and started speaking Navajo, and he just trips everybody out. He first did it with Chinese, and he learned this. I would say it's called Maori. It's a language of an indigenous people that's basically hasn't been westernized, modernized at all, and they live in the jungle in what country is it? It's in South America, and he learned their language, and then he went and spent time with the people, and they eat like they're one of their primary food sources are monkeys that they shoot with darts that they hunt down, and they live off monkey meat, and they've done that for centuries, and whatever else they can find there, you know, and that's very different than what indigenous Eskimos in Alaska live off of, right? Or what people from all around the globe would have lived off. There's so many different ways in which we can nourish ourselves. And there are some genetic differences, and that's been sort of the basis for things like the blood type diet and all that kind of stuff. And people will, without a doubt, have foods that suit them better. There's no doubt. But all in all, we as humans can live off of all sorts of different, of large variety of foods. So if someone finds, for whether it's a biological, physiological reason that diet is good for them, or it's purely a psychological one, as long as it's just not too asinine, I'm all for whatever they can stick with, what they feel good on, or whatever suits their clan. It may be like I'm keto, and that's how I identify, right? Awesome, that's cool, because we all do that to some degree. So pretty loose as far as for people whose primary goal is just to lose weight, and they just got a lifestyle approach. I'm pretty loose as far as to what I would suggest is going to be functional for someone like that.
Oh man, I have so many comments about that around all
Go
that.
for it, please.
I mean, I think I do like that idea of, as long as you're not, pushing yourself into nutrient deficiencies, how you get to the end goal doesn't necessarily matter. If you get there with the same blood work and the same nutrient adequacies, then however you decide to do it doesn't really matter. So I like the idea of everyone just choosing what feels the easiest for them, because that's what's really gonna um, get them to their goals and allow them to actually maintain it. So I think that's awesome. The other thing, coming back around, I know this wasn't the primary topic, but of ketosis. Just the idea that I've kind of been flirting around with for a little bit, about, I think at the end of a dieting phase, that when a lot of, athletes are basically eating a protein diet, it's very low carb and low fat, they end up not necessarily being, in the state of ketosis. So they're not making much ketones, but they don't have much glucose around, and this is where they start to feel extremely ravenous, and that's where they get into trouble. And my thought around it is that because of the way that ketones actually are able to cross the blood-brain barrier, that's where their sort of appetite suppressive effects come in, and because triglycerides and fatty acids can't do so, they kind of put themselves in a state where they have low blood glucose typically because they're not eating much, and they also have low blood triglycerides, but then again, they don't have any ketones in their blood. So they end up basically just putting their brain in a state of zero energy. And I wanted to hear your thoughts around maybe having, clients at the end of very close to a show, maybe actually increasing their fat intake in order to, get some of the at least cognitive benefits to maybe increase workout performance and cardiovascular performance, getting into a state of ketosis. So maybe in the end, instead of, being on, 1,000 calories, 1,500 calories a day, but being so mentally drained that that's how much they're burning, instead maybe transitioning almost into a ketosis diet where they may end up eating a little bit more, but they have the cognitive flexibility and almost a drive to actually burn a little bit more energy. So increasing what a lot of people refer to as the G flux. Um,
Mm.
what your thoughts are around something like that, and if you've ever implemented the ketogenic diet in any of your clients.
Yeah, that's there's a balancing act, especially when you're getting down to the pre-contest place where your body fat is extremely low, and if you want to continue to lose fat, you have to be really low with your calories. One of the things that, in order to make those kinds of manipulations and make them effective in some way, and I started doing this years ago. Now I think it's pretty much commonplace, is to ensure that your expenditure is at least somewhat consistent. So yeah, you can get in that place where if your diet is set up where you're not in ketosis in a way that feeds your brain, and you kind of get that feel good high from the ketosis, and that's highly variable actually. Um, it seems like, at least as far as to what extent people benefit from being deep in ketosis in terms of appetite suppression and a feeling of energy. Um,
I will ask on that one. Do you think
yeah,
it's just their ability to produce ketones or utilize them, or do you think that they're producing and using the same amount, they just simply don't feel the benefits?
I wish I know. I imagine if you had Dominic D'Agostino here, he would probably be able to answer that. The thing that's always been limiting with ketones is that, mainly we're just using keto sticks, right? So we're looking at ketones that are in the urinary ketones, and that doesn't necessarily reflect ketonemia, what's going on in the blood. So you can have a situation where someone's undergoing ketogenesis, they're making lots of ketones, and they're oxidizing, they're using them, right? They're being used as fuel, so they don't have ketonuria, and you don't have keto sticks. They're not, we used to call it pissing Barney. Your keto sticks don't turn purple because of the presence of ketones. So it's kind of hard to know, exactly if whether someone's starting to feel crappy because, they don't have high levels of urinary ketones. Um, I do know, and this is just from years ago, being part of a news group. Lyle McDonald was actually on there before he wrote his book, The Ketogenic Diet. Um, there were numerous people who had spent years in ketosis, eating the ketogenic diet for various reasons. There were a few of them that then transitioned out into carbohydrate-containing diets, and they would still have, at least per the keto sticks, urinary ketones, even though they weren't in the place that you would suspect dietarily, and you would also suspect from the insulin glucagon ratio that they'd be producing many ketones, but they had upregulated that aspect of their liver's fuel metabolism, so they're just producing ketones enough that they're not needing them really, they're not being oxidized, but they're spilling ketones into the urine. So people can turn that on, and it can also take, when people get into ketosis for the first time, oh, that can be dastardly for some people. That could be really, really painful to get there, and people just don't like that, being in that awkward position, and it takes some time to adapt, and there's high variability there. So I do think that there, without a doubt, there are some people who are just better at producing ketones. There's also potentially a long-term adaptation that occurs where some people, even if they're doing kind of a cyclical ketogenic diet where they would be in and out of ketosis, that simply reducing their carbohydrates, they go very easily back into ketosis, and there's no sort of transition period. Also, some people just have varying, and this is hard to tease out. This is where it would be a tough question if maybe there's something Dominic knows about, and I think he's doing a lot of work for the military now. So there probably knows of data that he can't even talk about because it's not published. It's internal data, but there probably there certainly must be something related to that, but it's hard to tease out as to how one's general psychological resistance to states of hunger fluctuates, because some people are just like, hey, it's just a thing, I'm hungry, and other people just they just freak out, and when they're not feeling well and they're hungry, and they just have a poor resistance to that, and that's like how you handle food, as like how we, especially as a Western society, handle food. Um, Eating disorders or disordered eating or a poor relationship with food is endemic in our society. It's everywhere. It really is. Um, I told this story on another podcast. I think maybe I was telling a friend about this. I can't recall, but um, this probably helped me as a bodybuilder, and this relates back to what we're talking about here. When I was in ninth grade, uh, I wrestled in eighth grade, and in ninth grade, I wrestled at 135 was my weight class. In 132 maybe, and then 135 in eighth grade. And then in ninth grade, they said, well, if you want to wrestle, because I was now wrestling against everyone, all the high school kids, if you want to wrestle, you're going to have to wrestle at 123. And I had a growth spurt. So I came in weighing like 160, something like that. And I was told I needed to now diet down to 123. In order to do that, my weekly diet was 3 cups of cornflakes and 3 oranges with 1.5 cups of skim milk per week. Per week. Breakfast would be every other day would be a cup of cornflakes with a half cup of skim milk or an orange. And then I would eat nothing else during the day. That's just totally asinine, right? So I was used to that as a kid. And I just did that. I didn't know any better. No one was saying, hey, you shouldn't do this. This is bad for you. You could mess up your metabolism, whatever. I just did that. So I got tolerant to that. So I think among bodybuilding athletes, for me, at least as a coach, with my experience, not knowing this has been done in the research, and especially with sort of Westerners, to be able to tease out how they feel when they're in an emaciated, dieted down situation relative to the blood levels of ketones, there might be so many other factors. Their history with food, their just general tolerance to suffering or discomfort. It's kind of tough to see. But that being said, this never happened to me, but I know many people, when they've used supplementary ketones as a dietary supplement, even the ketone salts, which are poorly absorbed, they have a sense of well-being. They feel better. They can take those before training as brain fuel, and they do much better. John Meadows, he had one of his Granite Supplements company products had what was the name of the product? I'm not sure if they still make it, but he felt that was the case, and he was able, when he was developing the product, he was taking just the ketone salts, and he could tell that. I never noticed a thing, but I've been keto dieting or low carb dieting for years, and I tolerate that really, really well. It's no wonder, given what I did was in high school. Like, that was basically starvation for months. You can't get much worse than that. So I have a different perspective on those things. So, but the thing is, in that context, as far as a solution for people who are kind of wondering, they say they do really well with the ketogenic diet. It keeps their hunger low. It makes the accounting of your diet much easier, because you don't have carbs to worry about. You're not worried about mixing carbs with fats. You're just eating protein and fat. You got your calories for the day. You got your protein. You got your calories. You just figure out what your protein is worth calorically, and then the rest of your calories comes from fat. And that's it. Done deal. Simple. You don't got to do much thinking about that. But what people can do is a targeted ketogenic diet. And even something like 20 grams of carbs taken before a training session can bump someone out of ketosis and give them some clarity. This doesn't work for everyone, but it can help people train harder. And it's really an interesting thing. Something about the body sensing influx of carbohydrates can have an ergogenic effect. And you see this actually with mouth rinsing studies, where you just taste something sweet. Your body's like, okay, I have energy, right? And that makes sense, right? If you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, it's like, we just came across a mother load of berries that are great. It's good to be energized, because we need to now gather those things as hunters and gatherers and take them home. So don't be sluggish when it's time to gather all those berries and take advantage of the food source you've just come across. So just tasting those, turn that on lickety split, because who knows, how much time you'll have to gather those and take care of them. So there is something to just doing a targeted. So it's a cyclical ketogenic diet, but your carbohydrates are targeted around your workouts. And you take in 20 grams of carbs before a long training session. Let's say you're training legs or some large muscle group. Um, you're going to be back into ketosis after your workout's over within a couple hours. So then you have that appetite suppressing effect of ketogenesis. So you bump out, you train, probably an ergogenic effect there just from the mouth rinse, so to speak. If the carbs aren't probably doing much as far as actually fueling the contractions, but if your brain's lit up better, you're going to train better. And then people know, like, the hardest part of a workout when you're at the end of a diet or you're like really sluggish is just getting going, right? Most of the time, not that they're not hard, but most of the time, once you're over the hump and you're up and running, it's like, okay, you got some adrenaline going, you can make it through the workout. And then by that time, the carbs are out of your system and you're back into ketosis in an hour or two. So that's a great question. I
Yeah.
love ketogenic diets.
All right. I did want to hear your thoughts on it because I know there are a few different opinions in the space. Definitely, Dave Palumbo is, the big on ketogenic diets, and some people think that the idea of not having carbohydrates for hypertrophy is just crazy. So I did want to hear your
That's
thoughts
another
on that.
topic. That's another topic, though. For gaining, yes, that's tough. Um, you need the energy. And I know Dave's been saying that for years. And the thing that you've probably heard people say, and I don't know if Dave diets people with ketogenic diets in the off season when they're trying to gain size. I don't think he does that. I
I
think
don't
he uses.
believe so. I couldn't see much of a reason for that.
Okay, I thought that's what you were saying. He might have said, or that was kind of the thought
No, I know
you
I
wanted to
know he
get at.
likes to use them for his dieting phase. But I think he's said in the past that, carbohydrates are for the off season pretty much.
Yeah. Well, Dave's famous McDonald's diet, with all the metrics drinks. I mean, that obviously wasn't low in carbohydrates. So if you always got to look back. It's just always an interesting thing that someone says, this is what I suggest people do, and they were a successful athlete in the past. Like, well, what did you do, right? Did you ever train that way? And I'm not going to cite any examples, but yeah, I don't think Dave is suggesting people like try to gain on a ketogenic diet. But people can use as a way to, if people are interested, like if someone's used a ketogenic diet or a cyclical ketogenic diet to diet down, to do a photo shoot or just for the summer or what have you, and then they want to go into an off season. One way that, and this is what I generally suggest, and it's sort of like it would be a targeted ketogenic diet, at least technically, as you at one point in time in the transitioning period, is you just add carbohydrates before or in an intra workout. So usually I have people take that a little bit before they start to train and throughout the workout, and you target your carbohydrates around your training. So you would have a post workout meal with carbohydrates, and then the rest of your diet, you might not technically be in ketosis per se, depending on how much those carbs were, but you continue the diet you were in previously. So your increment, your bump in calories is coming at the time when your body is just set up to use those, and you're potentially getting an ergogenic effect from the carbs that are around during your workout or before your workout. So targeted ketogenic diets. I do know people who have used those who just do well with ketogenic diets in general, and don't mind eating a lot of meat and maybe adding supplemental fat and that sort of thing, and have used carbs just around their workouts. Not many people do that. I think if that were like some magical solution, then a lot of people will be doing that, but we don't see that. We just certainly don't. But that's at least a transition from a more strict ketogenic diet into an off-season diet that I think can be readily employed. Eventually, you get to the point where you can only take in so much fat, um, and cardiovascular effects. It just can be wreak havoc on your digestive system to some degree. So at some point, more carbohydrate is usually where you're going to fill in those extra calories. If someone's trying to get to 5,000 calories a day, eventually you're probably going to have to eat some carbs to do that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I have a bunch of thoughts around that. I do think that, at least for bodybuilders, if they're going to try and implement something like a ketogenic diet, I think because I have looked at some of the different doctors that are, their role is ketogenesis for strictly like obese people. And they definitely
Mm,
find a lot of times that at first, when they get on a ketogenic diet, their urinary ketones are extremely high, but they have
mm-hmm,
very low energy because they're basically making ketones, but they're just peeing them all out. So
mm,
they're almost peeing out all their energy. And then a lot of times, the more experienced people who are on the ketogenic diet actually have lower ketones levels in their urine just because they're using more of them. So I think
mm-hmm,
it kind of demonstrates that if you're going to implement it specifically for, especially for giving you that cognitive boost at the end of like a contest prep, it'd be something that you'd probably have to have implemented at least for a prolonged period of time so you can go through that keto adaptation phase, I think.
mm-hmm. Some
And
people just
then,
I've had people who don't adapt very well. They can be in ketosis and they come at it for a while, and the next time they try to go, it takes them just as long, and they just keep having trouble getting into ketosis. So anyway, I think I interrupted you. Sorry about that.
no, I think, and it's weird. So there's some different studies where like the big researchers they see some people take for to get into the full keto adapted state. They report sometimes it taking upwards of like a year. So I don't know if even taking that much time in terms of a bodybuilder, like a lot of times they just simply don't have, a year to go on a low carbohydrate diet for the sake of
Mm-hmm.
keto adaptation because
Mm-hmm.
you can't, unless they're somehow going to figure out a way to maintain doing so. Um, and I think that's where I think I've seen a lot less people trying to at least do a gaining phase or grow muscle on a ketogenic diet, but a lot more try and do it at least on a carnivore diet. Obviously, it's not nearly as popular as just the normal everyday diet, but some people
Mm.
seem to have somewhat more success on the carnivore diet simply just because they're almost eating expensive carbohydrates in the form of protein and end up
Yes.
turning it into carbohydrates. So I don't know if you have any thoughts around. Obviously, I don't think any Olympian would be able to sustain themselves on that, but maybe as a natural bodybuilder or just someone like a younger kid trying to grow a substantial amount of muscle, where is that balance between um, just eating a lot more protein and eating sufficient carbohydrates? I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
So yeah, I do. The overarching as far as making gains and putting on muscle mass, your genetic proclivity to do so is going to be the main thing that governs how much progress you make. In general, at least one of the main things. The other thing that's really, really important for your average person, especially someone who's not enhanced, and this is super important in today's day and age because if you go on Instagram and you let the algorithm decide what you see, you're going to see the most clicked on pictures, which are almost always of people who are enhanced, who are competitors, and the people who are enhanced who have really good genetics on top of that. And it's just natural we're going to compare ourselves against those people, right? And the one thing that I think most people have more control over, some people just have poor genetics in this regard as well, is they can be lean. And when you look lean, you look bigger than than when you're not lean at the same amount of muscle mass. So if you're eating a carnivore diet, let's say, and you're going to just be limited as that what kind of a caloric excess you can have, all that protein is going to limit your appetite. Um, you're going to tend, and there's the thermodynamic effect of protein, et cetera, et cetera. You're just going to simply be leaner in most cases because you're on that diet, and it's going to limit how much body fat you can put on. In the minds of most people, I think that's a more comfortable place than doing what I don't see very people doing very often is saying, okay, I'm going to take some body fat here. I'm going to lose my Instagram like physique, and I'm not going to try to bloat myself into the most monstrous, blob of gelatin that I possibly can and get excessively fat. But um, that is going to be something that if someone wants to put on the ultimate amount of muscle mass they can, there's going to have to be some period of time where where they've got, for the average person, more body fat than they want to carry around on an average basis. You don't want to go to 25, 30% body fat for a guy. That's going to be excessive. So you can grow to some degree without those carbohydrates, but getting in that excess energy that you need to optimize muscle growth, in that 20, 25 pounds of muscle mass scenario we talked about, it takes very little protein, right? But it might take 500 calories per day to grow an extra pound of muscle in a week, something like that. I think that's one of the numbers, and that's highly variable too. The thing we don't know, it's not a black and white issue, and I got a message from someone, and it kind of gave me a reading of the pulse of how people understand things based on what they're seeing, I think, in social media, generally the internet, is that you simply need to. His thought was, and you're going to see through this, of course, that this doesn't make any sense, but his thought was, all you need to do is eat in excess and continue to lift, and in excess, whatever that might mean, and then the excess calories are going to go to muscle mass, because he's going to have a perfect P ratio, right? It's all going to go to muscle. And the thing is that the sort of dose response in the course of training that you get from eating in an excess may be that if you want to gain, once you've got a lot of muscle mass, another pound of muscle, that might mean at least another pound of fat. On average, you take people and overfeed them. There's a couple really good overfeeding studies that lasted several months. They're done up in Canada. You see high variations in how much body fat people put on, and high variations in terms of lean body mass. There's a pair of twin studies I've talked about that Claude Bouchard did years ago, in the 90s, literally, and they gave them 1,000 calories a day they developed a caloric balance, maintenance level calories for a couple of weeks, kept them sequestered in a clinic, and then they fed them 6 out of 7 days a week, 1,000 calories a day in mixed macro. There's no training involved here. Mixed macronutrient diet. So they were basically 6,000 calories in caloric excess based on their initial maintenance level, right? So they didn't measure maintenance and continue to ensure that was 1,000 calorie excess. But all the things that can come into play, your NEAT, your resting metabolic rate, all the things that go into how you metabolize where that energy goes, came into play. And at the end, you saw like a threefold range in terms of how much weight was gained. Same was true of body fat and fat-free mass. But about 1/3 of that fat-free mass, of 1/3 of that weight was fat-free mass. So someone gains, 21 pounds, maybe 7 of that would be fat-free mass. Or hope that most of that's muscle. Maybe the organs got a little bit bigger too. So if you're someone who is average and you're training, maybe you can turn 1 out of 3 pounds into 2 out of 3 pounds of the weight gain is fat-free mass. But you got to have the weight gain, and it's not all going to be, and that ratio is going to change as you get closer to your genetic limit. So when you get to the point where eventually there's going to have to be some fat that you don't want to see happen. This is talking about a totally natural person. This happens relatively rapidly. I mean, if someone who's totally natural, they might, in 5 years, they're not going to gain much. Statistically speaking, you're not going to gain probably a lot of muscle mass after 5 years of really heavy training. You can look better on stage. You can make progress without a doubt. You can go from third place, to first place. But in terms of going from, okay, I gained, 10 pounds my first 2 years, 20 pounds my next 2 years, you're not going to get 20 pounds the next 2 years. There's a law of diminishing returns that's going to rule the roost here. So back to this carnivore diet idea, I think that's a nice way to have a built-in governor on what type of a caloric excess you can have. It's very difficult to get fat eating primarily protein, and you can't eat a caloric excess in large amount if you're just eating steak and beef most of the time. If you just added lard to that, when you overfeed people selectively with one macronutrient, fat is the worst in terms of accumulating body fat. Carbs are better, and if it's just protein, basically it's almost impossible to get fat if you just add extra calories for protein. So the carnivore diet is somewhere sort of in between there. There's extra calories from fat, but there's so much protein. The glucagon levels are so high that inhibits your appetite. You just can't overeat. It's very, very difficult to do that. So people are going to look pretty good on that. But eventually, um, as opposed to, and you always use the twin study analogy is perfect. Like you take two twins and feed them on carnivore all they possibly can, and get what gains you possibly can off of that. And then at the ooh, it's getting close to 4 here. Um, uh, and then you have um, the other twin who says, okay, I'm going to stay covered up the entire time. I'm not going to post on Instagram. I'm not worried about how I look. I'm not going to the beach. Don't have a girlfriend. I'm going to just become, the clandestine bodybuilder. And he spends the next year, 16 months putting on as much muscle mass as he can, including carbohydrate in his diet. And then they both diet down, in that last 8 months or what have you. I bet you're going to see that guy who went the carbohydrate route and allowed some more body fat. He's going to probably be better because he's going to be able to eat more calories that way. Just going to probably. And if you look at the data, if you took those two scenarios and just added more fat, if you add more protein to a carnivore diet and add more protein, is not going to do much once you met your protein needs. Jose Antonio's got a nice study to that regard. If you add more fat, that's going to tend to be more just body fat. Jose Antonio's got another study with peanut butter. The peanut butter study. Like that's a really funny story, really funny study. But carbohydrates tend to not accrue so much changes in body weight as body fat. Plus, they have benefits in terms of ergogenesis and being able to train hard too. So that's super important. So these long-term studies like that where you go for years, those don't exist. But that's sort of my general observation. Thinking about really a lot of it is the psychology. Is if you're eating a low carb diet for many people, that just doesn't let you get fat. And I'll tell you an old story from long ago. This was like the 90s. I was listening to a radio. I think I was living in Atlanta at the time. So it was during my graduate school days, or I think it was when I was actually in graduate school, and I heard a radio interview with Atkins, and he literally used to say, he's like, you can eat all the meat you want on my diet as long as you don't have any carbs, and you won't get fat. And obviously that's not true, but he made that blanket statement because he knows that the nature of the diet is self-limiting. You're not going to get fat that way. So, I mean, let's just take now the semaglutide craze that we've got going on. Like, that's a perfect pharmacological strategy because it limits people's appetite, and they eat less. Even if they eat like junk, it can cause nutrient deficiencies, but they're going to eat less and they'll lose weight because of that. You take a low carb diet like that, and Atkins knew this from his experience, people are just not going to get super fat, or most people won't. There are people who will find a way, that's for sure, and that I've seen that too. But most people, if they eat a lot of steak, eat a carnivore style diet, they're just not going to be able to get fat. So it's a nice solution for most people who look better when they're leaner, and that's really kind of what it matters, what it comes down to. So
Me and my twin sister will have to run that twin study for you. We'll tell you the results.
See, well,
I know you
that's
got to
the
run.
interesting thing. No, it's okay. But one thought, I think let me see if I've heard anything here from this person.
Okay.
But the thing that's interesting is they did actually fraternal and identical twins in those studies, and the fraternal twins were not exactly the same, right? So you have a fraternal twin, I presume, and your sister. Were you
I
being
do.
serious?
I have a twin sister. Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah. So the identical twins were pretty much dead on in terms of their changes. Very, very similar. There's a line of identity when you compared twin A with twin B. That was really much, very, very strong correlation. But the fraternal twins were different. So it's not always, but sometimes fraternal twins can be very, very different. You never guess, right? So let me see here. Anyway, I'll check this in a second, but thank you, sir. This was a pleasure.
All right. So there's 100 other topics I'd love to talk to you about. So if we can schedule some after this one, I think everyone would benefit who's listening. So I just want to say thank you for your time. I
Likewise.
will put all of your links in the description so people can find you so you can get on your phone call. All right.
Cool. Yes, sir. And yeah, give me a little while. I've got some other podcasts to put out. We'll do a follow up. Do you have listener questions too, or are these just your questions?
Oh, these are all my questions, but
Ah,
I'm sure
okay.
people will have some questions. So honestly, we could do 10 series on this. So I'll find the best questions and make sure that the next one, if we get to do it, we'll have. If the listeners have any questions, we'll prioritize those ones.
That would be awesome. And lastly, congratulations on your graduation.
Thank
It's
you, sir.
awesome, man. Yeah, enjoy it. It's only happens once. So
Oh yeah, it'll
yeah,
be fun, but I'm glad to get out of high school. I'll say that.
I understand. Mine was 35 years ago tomorrow. So
Oh wow, okay.
yeah, June 6th is when I graduated. So enjoy it.
All right, all right. I will
Thanks, Calvin.
keep in touch with you, and I can share this with you if you'd like.
Absolutely. I'll share
All
it as
right.
well.
Have a good day, Mr. Stevenson.
Likewise, Calvin. Bye bye.